David Carr, Alan Rusbridger. E buonasera, grazie di essere qui in questo appuntamento fuori programma. Evidentemente il programma non era sufficiente, Giovanni, c'era ancora spazio per altri appuntamenti presi un po' di corsa, anche se nel primitivo progetto di questo festival internazionale questo doveva essere un po' l'incontro conclusivo, poi ci sono stati dei cambiamenti, l'incontro conclusivo sarà un altro, e però non abbiamo potuto invece raccogliere l'occasione di coinvolgere due tra gli ospiti più importanti da questo punto di vista di questo festival, ma direi anche del dibattito internazionale che c'è sul tema, su un tema, appunto, Fermate le rotative, che è un po' lo stesso del titolo dell'ultimo numero di Internazionale, che contiene un'ampia intervista a Alan Rusbridger, un titolo sufficientemente interessante, perché potrebbe sembrare un'invocazione, Fermate le rotative, oppure un'intimazione magari ironica o tragica, o addirittura più tragicamente una constatazione: le rotative si sono fermate, stop. I giornali non tirano, in tutti i sensi della parola, i giornali non tirano più. È un po' questo lo scenario che abbiamo di fronte, e tanto per citare gli ultimi numeri che dirò, è anche lo scenario italiano di questi giorni. È uscita la ricerca del Censis, e magari sono dati che interesseranno i nostri ospiti, una ricerca che registra il rapporto degli italiani con i media, e i dati sui giornali sono i più catastrofici. In 5 anni i lettori dei quotidiani sarebbero passati dal 67% al 45% del paese, cioè in questi anni si sarebbe compiuta, diciamo, l'inversione, il fatto che diventava minoritaria, diciamo. E nei giovani fino a 29 anni questo dato scende al 33%. Del resto l'impressione che abbiamo tutti è di una perdita di centralità economica, numerica, ma non solo, da questi punti di vista dei giornali. E questo è un po', Giovanni, lo scopo di questa punto
in
di
Italia
partenza.
siamo tornati ai livelli di vendita dei quotidiani degli anni 50, no? Cioè c'è stata una curva salita e poi riscesa, mentre tutti gli indicatori di consumi culturali hanno continuato a salire, quelli dei quotidiani sono scesi e tornati agli anni 50. Io credo, però, ne parlavamo prima, che una delle ragioni per cui avere qui con noi stasera David Carr e Alan Rusbridger è importante, è anche perché il dibattito sul futuro dei giornali, sul futuro dell'informazione, sull'evoluzione, sul terremoto che stanno subendo i giornali, i quotidiani in particolare, ma non solo, è un dibattito che in realtà interessa o dovrebbe interessare non solo il nostro piccolo mondo di giornalisti, ma le società nel loro insieme. I giornali e i mezzi di informazione svolgono o dovrebbero svolgere un ruolo centrale in qualunque sistema democratico correttamente funzionante. Noi qui in questa parte di mondo tendiamo a dare per acquisiti, per scontati, no? La libertà di stampa, l'esistenza dei giornali, dei mezzi di informazione nel loro complesso. Però vale la pena ricordare che negli Stati Uniti, quindi diciamo in quello che viene considerata la punta avanzata dello sviluppo capitalistico occidentale, eccetera, dall'inizio dell'anno, solo dall'inizio dell'anno, hanno perso il lavoro, sono stati licenziati circa 1850 giornalisti dall'inizio dell'anno, dal 2012. David Carr mi confermava prima un altro dato che è altrettanto impressionante: dal 2006 a oggi si calcola, si stima prudenzialmente che più o meno la metà dei giornalisti americani siano stati licenziati e abbiano perso il loro lavoro. Parliamo di decine di migliaia di persone. È un problema ovviamente umano, è un problema sociale, è un problema economico, è un problema commerciale, ma è anche un problema che comincia a incidere anche nel corretto funzionamento di un sistema democratico. Vuol dire che negli Stati Uniti ci sono intere città, grandi città, che dall'oggi al domani non hanno più un quotidiano, dove non c'è più il quotidiano, chiudono i giornali. Cioè quello che noi consideravamo come un dato acquisito e scontato non lo è più. Ora, si dice i giornali stanno poco bene, ma il giornalismo non è stato mai meglio, è una delle teorie dei nostri ospiti, e sarà interessante capire anche perché, diciamo, quello che sembra un terremoto drammatico potrebbe trasformarsi anche in una grande opportunità. Credo che forse possiamo cominciare a sentire quello che ne pensano.
No, sì, facciamo la prima cosa che vorremmo fargli spiegare è non è tanto il perché lo sappiamo tutti, il perché c'è questa crisi. I giornali sono al centro di una, diciamo, chiamiamola così, tempesta perfetta. C'è una crisi economica che taglia enormemente gli investimenti pubblicitari e anche l'acquisto delle copie come prodotto di una crisi economica e di una riduzione dei consumi che ne riguarda altri, ma soprattutto il calo della pubblicità a proporzioni davvero catastrofiche. E c'è una rivoluzione tecnologica che, apparentemente o no, sembra permettere di accedere a quegli stessi contenuti che una volta stavano solo sui giornali di carta, erano per così dire sequestrati dalla forma che hanno i giornali di carta, e di accedervi in molti altri modi, in larga parte gratuiti. Queste due condizioni generano una tempesta perfetta. Ci sono meno soldi investiti sui giornali sia dalle grandi agenzie pubblicitarie sia da noi piccoli consumatori, e sembra persino esserci meno necessità di rivolgersi ai giornali perché quella stessa funzione viene svolta altrove. E allora la prima domanda che potremmo fare, anche a partire da una differenza che tra gli addetti ai lavori è nota tra il comportamento del New York Times, qui rappresentato dal suo più autorevole columnist sul tema dei media, cioè David Carr, e del Guardian, rappresentato a livello massimo dal direttore, che è Alan Rusbridger, loro hanno dato una risposta diversa al tema del rapporto tra giornale di carta e giornale online, o almeno all'aspetto del pagamento, che del resto capirete è decisivo, tanto che quando prima in un misto di italiano e inglese cercavo di spiegare a Rusbridger il tema della prima domanda, sbrigativamente David Carr ha detto pay or not to pay. Non so se era una citazione shakespeariana, però era diciamo, efficace nella sua sinteticità. Perché? Lo dico per chi insomma, ne sa meno, perché il New York Times ha scelto una formula cosiddetta freemium, cioè metà free e premium, in realtà con un piccolo numero di contenuti, cioè di accessi al sito, di articoli gratuiti, e poi subito dopo, ma a me sembra veramente molto presto, cioè sono molto poche le cose che si possono ottenere. Sì, 10 articoli.
10 stories, yeah.
Subito dopo forme di pagamento differenziate, 15, 25, 35 dollari mi sembra, ma insomma su questo poi saremo più specifici. E la soluzione del Guardian è molto diversa. In questa intervista pubblicata su Intelligent Life e ora su Internazionale, lo cito, tanto è chiaro, il Guardian non esclude in assoluto forme di pagamento per le sue versioni digitali, chiede una cifra simbolica per l'edizione in formato iPhone, 4,99 sterline l'anno, una più realistica per il formato iPad, 9,99 sterline al mese, ma si rifiuta di far pagare i contenuti del sito, che dunque è liberamente accessibile. Vi chiederei, cominciando da Rusbridger, esatto?
Non sentono più in cuffia la traduzione.
Invece, vabbè.
Da un certo punto
Adesso
in poi, quindi eccoci. Marino, io qui si vede che non... Ok.
Adesso ripeto la domanda. La domanda è, ho descritto le modalità diverse in cui i vostri siti sono accessibili gratuitamente, a pagamento con la modalità freemium nel vostro caso. Chiederei a Rusbridger, per cominciare, cosa ha generato la scelta apparentemente radicale del Guardian e che risultati ha comportato.
Well, first of all, I'd like to begin by being a bit more optimistic than than both of you about news. So I think when you say, when you talk about journalism and it being a very good age for journalism, I think that's true. I think the Guardian has never reached so many people. I think it is a better news organization than it's ever been. It is getting a better account of the world through lots of techniques that we are using by harnessing this unprecedented ability of everybody to be a publisher and to create material. We've moved way beyond the tired old debates about bloggers versus professional journalists. There's a really interesting middle ground. The Guardian, which is the 9th biggest paper in print in the UK, is now the 3rd biggest paper in the world, just behind David's paper and the Daily Mail. So I can't get too gloomy about the journalism. I think that the journalism is amazing, and we're in this extraordinary period of experimentation, which is expensive, and Marina's quite right to say that there is a kind of perfect storm which has come together to make this a very dangerous time, because it's going to be a very expensive time to learn how to do this new style of journalism and to work out where newspapers fit in. And so all this is true at the same time. It's a wonderful time to be a journalist, and it's also a very perilous time for the finances of news organizations. And that seems to me a bigger question, really, than plunging in straight to discuss paywalls. And the reason I say that is that I don't think that there is any magic bullet in paywalls, and all the markets are different. So one of the reasons we don't have a paywall is that we're working in a very different market from David's. We have 10 British newspapers in a very small island, and we have something called the BBC. The BBC is completely free. Sky News, run by Rupert Murdoch, is completely free. The ITV news is completely free. So you've got an awful lot of free competition and very good competition in the UK. So it is a completely different context from a paper like the New York Times, which is an absolutely wonderful paper, but essentially has New York to itself in terms of general news, and doesn't have an operation like the BBC right on its doorstep. So I've never said that we're never going to charge for news. I think probably readers should be prepared to make some kind of contribution. But I think the New York Times has executed its paywall brilliantly. But as far as I know, it still only accounts for 10% of the New York Times' revenues, and it's not the perfect answer, which is going to sweep aside all the bigger questions that we have to sort out about what journalism is and how it fits into the new ecostructure of news.
I do want to draw a very careful distinction between Alan and myself. Alan runs The Guardian. He sits on the board of the trust that owns The Guardian. I'm a reporter at the newspaper I work with, and my bosses listen very carefully to what I think of broader business issues, and then usually go the other way very quickly. So I'm in charge of doing my little stories and writing about the media. I don't have the box of lightning bolts on my desk like Alan does. So that said, that stipulation made, I'm going to disagree. Well, one thing I'd like to say for certain, I think Alan rightfully points out that in many senses, the things that have destroyed our business model have vastly enriched our ability to execute news. I think we're going to be looking back at this time at the depth of coverage, at the breadth of coverage, and saying this was a golden age of journalism. But those same forces of digitized news, of participation of people formerly known as the audience, and the free flow, frictionless flow of information represent an existential threat on what we do. Newspapers are built on an economic model of scarcity. When you open it up and you see an ad on page 3 in the upper right-hand corner, at our place, Tiffany's, the jewelers, has been there for over 100 years. There's only one of those. There's only one. And we sell that to them at a premium. At the web, there's an infinite amount of those. And so there's no leverage that we can exercise on price. So even though we have 40 million unique users, we have more audience than we've ever had, advertising doesn't provide the revenues that it historically has. It's lost compression. So the turn toward the audience is very natural. And as you've indicated, you show up 10 times. It's like you go to your friend's house 10 times, and each time he offers you a glass of wine and says, have a little nibble. And then you come the 11th time and say, well, how about give me a couple euros for all this wine and all this food? Show us a little love. The idea that consumers would participate, and I think Alan doesn't characterize our competitive situation entirely appropriately. Number one, we don't have New York all to ourselves. There are 4 or 5 newspapers there, depending on how you, and to suggest that the competitive set is limited to newspapers these days, I think is not the best way of looking at things. We decided at a certain point that there were not only people that were willing to pay, but wanted to pay. And we were told all the time, at the time, by people who have a religious belief, a theological belief, that all information would be free, that we would drop out of the ecosystem of the web, that we would not be seen, no longer visible, and that nobody would give us any money. We now have 500,000 people paying us, and Alan describes it as that's just 10% of the money you'd make. You'd love that money. You would love that. That's the one part of our business that seems to be growing. And this is the first year for us that consumer revenues surpassed advertising revenues. I think it's a very historic point in the newspaper business. It's not to say that a free product with global ambitions like The Guardian won't eventually pay out, but there is possibilities in turning toward the consumer as well.
I mean, I do agree with that, and I said that I think it is a good thing if you can persuade people to pay. I think I mean, there are two more differences between us. Is that Britain is a small place, and The Guardian has probably got the saturation of the market there, where we've moved from being the fourth biggest to the biggest across print and digital, and that will change the value of what we can charge in advertising. And the other difference is that the New York Times traditionally has had a very strong subscription department and knows who most of its readers are in print. Is that right? Yes. Whereas in Britain it's been much more of a newsstand sale, and we don't know who our readers are. So what the New York Times has brilliantly done is bundled print and digital together in a way that no one has yet achieved in a small market like Britain. So David's right to say that The Guardian has global ambitions, partly because 2/3 of our audience now don't live in Britain. And so it is very interesting to try and monetize the 2/3 who already come to The Guardian and are reading us. And I think if we were to put up some kind of paywall now, that would cut off the growth. So there are different strategies, but we may end up converging in the end.
I think it is worth mentioning that one of the organizations we compete with in the U.S. is The Guardian, has moved aggressively and well and made really smart hires. And we're sort of frenemies. We cooperate when it works, but the Guardian is aiming to be a significant player in U.S. media, and we wish them the best only to a certain point until it starts to hurt us. Then we don't wish them the best.
Devo porre delle obiezioni, diciamo così, no? Nel senso che se no poi non fanno pace troppo presto, finisce troppo presto la serata. che invece arriverà almeno fino all'inizio del concerto di Capostela e forse anche un pochino oltre. Naturalmente chi vuole, compreso il direttore della rivista, può abbandonare, però la cosa quando comincia Capostela, però poi se il futuro dei giornali va ma insomma, ecco, pure colpa vostra. Nel caso del Guardian, l'obiezione, diciamo, Alan, è il problema dei costi. Naturalmente voi state spendendo e investendo molto per operare una trasformazione come questa. Sul numero di internazionali ci sono 2 bellissime tabelle, non riuscirete a vederle tutte, dovrete comprare internazionale. E nella prima...
No, si vede là dietro, guarda.
No, vabbè, ma
si intravede, no, ma...
No, vabbè, nella prima si vede, ed è già una cosa significativa, la curva delle vendite. Vabbè, non riesco a... Non ho capito dove è la telecamera, è dentro bottiglia d'acqua. Cioè si vede solo se vede il software. In una delle 2 curve si vede la vendita in rosso delle copie in edicola e in blu l'accesso al sito. Ovviamente a un certo punto nel 2010 le 2 curve si sono incontrate. Naturalmente qui potete vedere la curva, come si dice, la curva mezza piena e la curva mezza vuota, il bicchiere mezzo pieno e il bicchiere mezzo vuoto. C'è un'ascesa in realtà molto importante, per esempio accennava, ed è un dato molto significativo per un quotidiano di lingua anglosassone, il mercato globale, compreso il mercato americano, raggiunto attraverso questa grande crescita nell'online. Vedete pure una curva rossa, non la facciamo vedere a Rusbridger perché non voglio imbarazzare, la vediamo solo noi, perché, insomma, in cui c'è un dimezzamento delle copie in edicola. Naturalmente non sappiamo che relazione c'è tra il dimezzamento delle copie in edicola e la diffusione online, però sappiamo, Alan, che a destra c'è una curva delle perdite e che implica che con questo sistema una 40-50 milioni di euro l'anno, dollari, di sterline, diciamo un po' più, 45 milioni di sterline, quindi 55, com'è il cambio? Non mi ricordo mai se stiamo no, 40 milioni di euro, no, perché io penso al bilancio della RAI, quindi mi sembra uno scherzo, però vabbè, devo fare 40 milioni di perdita. Cioè, sono una cifra, quindi occorrono delle condizioni, diciamo, per proseguire la vostra politica occorrono delle condizioni. Una condizione è quella economica, la seconda mi sembra è di capire come quella curva in ascesa blu diventerà anche, quindi la crescita online genererà anch'essa qualcosa di economico che attualmente non si vede. Avete un'idea del futuro da questo punto di vista o è solo la straordinaria munificenza del vostro trust, il famoso trust scozzese, una forma molto particolare tra l'altro di proprietà che vi consente di continuare questo esperimento?
Well, again, I have to give a bit of context. So this very crowded British newspaper market doesn't operate as a market. So you have the Times, the Independent, and the Guardian. Of those 3 papers that are all competing in the same space, the Times is supported by Rupert Murdoch, God bless him, and the Times loses probably about twice as much as the Guardian. So the Guardian, which is this supposedly not very economic thing, is probably twice as profitable as the Times. Difficult to tell because the figures are very muddled. And then you have the Independent, which is supported by a Russian oligarch. So what the Scott Trust does is to get us onto the playing field so that we can experiment at all. It's not a cushion so that we can behave inefficiently or do stupid things. It means that in a world in which the market isn't a market, it's a collection of papers that between them lose about 100 million. The Guardian has got the funds to do this experiment. The chief reason the Guardian it has moved into loss in the last 2 or 3 years is the loss of print advertising. Some of it is to do with print circulation, and again, in the UK, the British quality market is declining at about 10%. Doesn't seem to matter whether you put up a complete paywall. The Times has a paywall that makes Davies look very, very porous. So there's no way of getting the Times content in print or digitally except by paying, but it doesn't seem to make any difference to the overall rate of decline in print. So if you've got a market which is declining at about 10% a year in print, it doesn't seem to me that you have to think very hard about whether you're going to put your energies and bank the future primarily on digital or print. So then you're slightly at the mercy of how quickly the advertising agencies and the clients are going to move to digital, because they surely will in the end, and they are very fast at the moment. And how do they measure things? Well, in America, where, as I say, we suddenly discovered we had, depending on how you want to measure it, 20 million or 10 million, 20 million browsers, 10 million people who had come to The Guardian without us spending a single dollar on advertising. You don't get onto American advertising schedules unless, you know, those decisions are made by 25-year-old to 30-year-old people in advertising agencies, unless you're on the front page of the sheet of A4 on traffic. The Guardian's not going to get any money for all those people who are reading The Guardian. And so at the moment, you're partly in a traffic game. It may not be what we want to play, it may not be where we'll end up, but in order to get on the map of advertisers in the US, we have to go for the traffic game rather than trying to put up a paywall game. So all these things are very complicated. They're to do with who is against us, what is the distortions in the market, and we certainly have a route through to sustainability, which is going to involve some cutting of cost, like everybody, but also a lot of investment in the kind of experimentation. So we are deliberately losing money at the moment, because I think unless you can invest in all the things that you need to do, you're not going to understand the future.
Per Carr la domanda è un po' questa. Io sono colpito da questo dato che avevo letto del 10% che viene dal mercato digitale, perché credo che per l'Italia sarebbe un dato altissimo, però non lo so perché non amministro quotidiani, però credo che il 10% dal mercato digitale, diciamo così, ed è altrettanto interessante il dato che David Carr ha detto, cioè il fatto che per la prima volta l'anno scorso in questo 10% il ricavo da accesso, quindi da lettori, ha superato quello della pubblicità, e questo è effettivamente un dato interessante perché ci indica una tendenza. Ora, tra qualche giorno credo uscirà questo Page One, il film ambientato esce da Feltrinelli, no? Mi sembra,
sì,
già uscito.
Ed era l'anno scorso qui a Ferrara.
Sì,
vabbè, diciamo che
un anno
molti
dopo,
l'hanno visto.
voleva dire che un anno dopo esce una cosa che a Ferrara è stata presentata un anno prima, però esce questo Page One, che è appunto una sorta di viaggio dentro il New York Times, nel quale si vedono anche scene strazianti, nel senso si vedono scene di persone che devono abbandonare il giornale, e perché la politica dei costi credo sia molto, questa politica di riduzione dei costi cui accennava Alan è stata effettuata in maniera molto, insomma, molto forte, necessariamente forte. C'è anche, se ho capito bene, perché ho una copia mezza tradotta e mezza no, non so se era quella di Internazionale, evidentemente un po' fallata, c'è a un certo punto un evento un po' epocale in cui, nella storia del New York Times, in cui una copia del New York Times costa più di un'azione del New York Times, se ho capito bene quello che accade un giorno nella tempesta dei mercati finanziari che stiamo vivendo. Ecco, in questa situazione, inutile dirlo adesso, dai contorni senz'altro drammatici, le cifre che citava prima Giovanni sul mercato americano, è immaginabile, ed è questo il vostro progetto, ed è questo il vostro tentativo, o almeno la vostra speranza, una crescita di quella quota digitale? È immaginabile che il mercato digitale raggiunga cifre che compensino il tracollo pubblicitario, la perdita dei lettori, la perdita dei mercati collaterali, che sono stati un elemento forte per i quotidiani di carta negli anni alle nostre spalle?
One of the things that I think you need to think about is when you see in the movie or in the news journalists getting laid off, that's no more important or significant than people being laid off all over America. It's been happening. we fetishize the loss of jobs in journalism, but there's misery throughout our economy. And we shouldn't pay, even though I'm a media reporter, I try not to pay any more attention to the fact that it's reporters being laid off than auto workers or service workers. I'm always afraid when I'm writing layoff stories that I'll be typing along and I'll end up typing my own name. David Carr got laid off today. Is it what? That I'm just going to be typing away and all of a sudden I'll see my own name. When the movie was made was a particularly dark time in our history. Part of the way you should think about, part of the way I think about journalism, and I think it goes with what Alan's saying. We were in one room and we were working on one kind of business. And there's another business down the hall that's probably a mostly digital business. We're in that hall, and you know what? It's very dark and scary in there. And the hall is super long. Good things have been happening for us lately in that we don't, number one, we have $1 billion on hand. 4 years ago, we were borrowing money from a Mexican billionaire, which is probably not a good person to owe money to. Because those of us that work there, we say, who is this Carlos Slim guy? Is he, why are we borrowing money at usurious rates from a Mexican billionaire? Things can't be that great. And we've since paid him back early. We have a better capital picture. We still confront the very difficult math that Alan is talking about. But there is an indication, I mean, our circulation is up, if you, in measurable terms, 73% in the last year. And part of what you need to think about is we're not just getting money from consumers. Part of the problem we have is our content and Alan's content, you can find it anywhere. It gets replicated over and over again on the Huffington Post, on Gawker, in International, although they pay for it. But again and again, you can find what we do. You can also find our audience, that the marketers in the US will replicate our audience and say, you don't have to buy that from the New York Times. We can get the same people. By having a group of people that either pay for the newspaper in print or pay for the newspaper digitally, we have an audience that can't be replicated. These are people who've given us money because they love our product. And as Alan correctly points out, we know more about them. And they become a more, the problem is what used to be dollars in print have become dimes on the web. We need to go back the other way. The scary part, and I'm sure Alan could, is what if we move from a computer and tablet world to a phone world? Then it goes dollars, dimes, pennies. Because there's no real estate on your phone left to really sell. We can't put a little strip ad in there and charge a lot of money for it. So the fact that in some cases the screen size is shrinking is also a fundamental threat to what we do. We, like The Guardian, have decided whatever way you want to consume us is just great. And it makes for a complicated technological challenge because we have to serve people, idiots like me who are still on BlackBerry. We have to serve up for iPads, for Nexus, and the stream of information that we have to send out, like when we do videos, is just endlessly complicated. And it comes at a time when we don't have a lot of money laying around to invest. So at precisely the moment there is a great business opportunity, we don't have a bunch of money to jam into winning the day.
C'era una cosa che a me interessa piuttosto sapere parecchio sapere da tutti e due, è in che modo sta avvenendo, è avvenuta e sta avvenendo la trasformazione da diciamo così, giornali locali, cioè nazionali, a giornali, a media globali, no? C'è una lezione di una conferenza di qualche anno fa di Alan Rusbridger in cui avevi recuperato il foglietto delle vendite all'estero del Guardian negli anni 50 ed erano dell'ordine delle centinaia, e confronti questo dato con il dato degli accessi dall'estero, dalla Gran Bretagna. Tu lo ricordavi, più di 2/3 non vivono in Gran Bretagna e nel Regno Unito degli utenti del Guardian, e certamente così anche per il New York Times. Immagino che come dire, la trasformazione da media, il New York Times fino a qualche anno fa era un giornale che se non si viveva a New York non si poteva sapere cosa c'era scritto. C'è in Europa una versione europea che è l'Herald Tribune, fatto fino a qualche tempo fa con Washington Post, ma insomma non è la stessa cosa, no? E la stessa cosa valeva per il Guardian. Improvvisamente il giornalista del Guardian o il giornalista del New York Times viene eletto istantaneamente in qualunque posto del mondo ci si trovi e si abbia accesso a internet, no? Immagino che questo significa in qualche modo modificare, forse anche profondamente, mi interessa capirlo, oppure no, la mentalità, il modo con cui si pensa al giornale. Cioè, in che modo il fatto che voi vi rivolgete, siete su una platea che improvvisamente è mondiale, non è più soltanto circoscritta al vostro singolo paese, cambia il modo in cui fate il giornale? Lo cambia o non lo cambia?
Yes. I think this comes back to the nature of the opportunity as well, and it's why the decisions we make in the next 2 or 3 years are going to be so important. So I think what has happened in America, and David knows far more about this than me, but I think that a lot of news organizations in America, including the networks, have become much more parochial and have removed themselves from their ability to tell international stories. You can just nod or shake. Yeah, he agrees with that. And I think increasingly the world is unintelligible except through international stories. You can't understand the economy or business or security or immigration or the environment or lots of things about culture unless you have the ability to tell stories internationally and place them in a context. So if you're like The Guardian and you think globally and you have not cut back whatever else you've cut, you haven't cut back your concentration on the world and you've remained very outward focusing, then you become an important player and you become quite a rare player, and you will be increasingly rare in the future. And so the Americans who come to us, they come to us not because we're better than the New York Times, but because we are internationally engaged. We can explain the world in ways that a lot of American news organizations have given up on altogether. We will tell stories in a different way from the New York Times because the British press, the European press, has a different tradition, political tradition, journalistic tradition than America, and there are enough Americans who find that necessary and interesting and valuable. So this thing that has happened, that we've discovered that, as I said, so our global unique audience now is somewhere in around 60 million. You're quite right, that compares with about 100,000 in the late 1950s when the Guardian moved from being a local paper, the Manchester paper, to being a national paper. It's now moved to being an international paper with this vast audience. And the reason they're coming to us is because we are an international paper. We can place these extraordinary times of change in an international context.
I think it's a great question because there's two things have happened to flatten out the world. One is information, with the exception of certain totalitarian regimes, moves freely across the globe. That's great news for us because the second and third world is hatching customers for quality branded information every single day. I think Alan is correct in pointing out that there is a kind of last, not man, last person standing fight underway that includes Thomson Reuters, includes The Guardian, includes AFP, where at precisely the moment when the world has become more global and international, organizations across the world have withdrawn resources and pulled back and become far more provincial. So there is a great opportunity in there. And I do think that the historical American hegemony in both international affairs and in journalism is not a sustainable model going forward. And we can't say that we're projecting American greatness all over the world when the world doesn't want what we have, right? And we need to be less provincial and see that people see America's role as a complicated one. And in order to take advantage of the global opportunity, we need to have perspective on what we do. And I do think there's a huge landing strip for quality branded information. If you look, tonight you guys lined up outside like Radiohead was playing here. You know, it's just like, I pulled up and I looked around and I said, who is this for? Is there a concert here somewhere? Or no, we're gonna talk about the future of journalism with you. People are interested. I have children that are 24 years old. They know as much as I did when I was 24 years old. I don't know how they know it. I don't know where they learn it. They care a little bit less about where they get information, which is sort of scary because we're in the branded information, but it's like air. It comes in osmotically. I don't think, people always argue that the current generation is focused only on Facebook and Twitter and their social. I don't see it. That isn't, I think there's a great opportunity if we figure out how to bring, I mean, if you look into Twitter, for example, every 4 seconds, Twitter is carrying information from the New York Times. We thought they were our enemy. They are our friend. They're helping us access enormous audience. I have 380,000 followers on Twitter, and it's because my last name is New York Times. It's been very, very good for us. Again, we're in that hall. We got to figure out how to get to the next room with, as Alan points out, still having the capacity to do the big stories, to remain ambitious on a global level.
Can I just give one example of, as we're both sitting here on this sofa, the Guardian and the New York Times, of how this international information is shrinking the world and changing the nature of information, and that was WikiLeaks. We were the people who originally made contact with Julian Assange and got the information, these extraordinary caches of information, first about the Iraq War and then about the State Department. And the first thing I did was to ring David's editor at that time, Bill Keller, because I thought what this information is going to need is the protection of the American First Amendment. And I think people have, in all the exotic coverage of Julian Assange, people have sometimes lost this. But what that did was, for the first time, I think, free information from the tyranny of, which is an increasing tyranny of totalitarian regimes that are very effectively clamping down on information, and use the hinge of a British newspaper to get under the shelter of the American First Amendment. And I think there are experiments that are going to be repeated like that, which are going to be, again, a very important bit of this new jigsaw of how internationally engaged news organizations are going to work.
And keep in mind that Julian Assange had put out information time after time, and it didn't get the bounce that he wanted. And what did he do? He went and developed an ad hoc confederation with your help of newspapers, significant newspapers, to harness the ability of journalism to shape information and put it out there. And it created so much more bounce for WikiLeaks. So the argument that newspapers no longer have relevance, I mean, Julian's a smart guy. And one of the decisions he made was to work with newspapers to get that stuff out there.
Sì. Ma sempre io devo dire che trovo molto coraggioso la politica del Guardian e anche molto efficace da un certo punto di vista. Certo, quella curva che vi ricordate, facevo vedere o intravedere prima, ma fidatevi, indicava inevitabilmente quello che molti di noi già stanno provando come esperienza personale, al di là della professione che fanno, cioè che via via che un sito diventa più curato, attendibile, veloce e aggiornato, diventa sempre più faticoso chiedere o concedere l'euro e 20 o la sterlina e 20 per la copia cartacea. Però questo, per esempio, venendo al riferimento che Dave faceva alle giovani generazioni, ha portato, sono i dati che ho visto, il Guardian a avere lettori tra i 18 e i 25 anni come mai nella sua storia. Ecco, questo, Alan, implica anche un elemento di trasformazione, diciamo così, della scrittura. Lei è ritenuto uno dei paladini, tu o lei, non so, tanto la traduzione è la stessa, è facilissimo, dell'open journalism. Ecco, spieghiamo cos'è nella vostra esperienza, non solo nella visione che Dave chiedeva al nostro futuro, l'open journalism, e che relazione c'è tra questo investimento nello spazio della rete e la politica, diciamo, dell'open journalism.
Well, the simplest, open journalism is a piece of shorthand. And the simplest way I explain it in a non-controversial way that even journalists buy into is to take the example of a theatre critic. So we're sitting in a theatre. And The Guardian has a wonderful theatre critic who's been writing for us since 1972, Michael Billington. And The Guardian would never be without a theatre critic. He's what we bring. But if you ask anybody, is it conceivable, there are what, 800 or 900 people here tonight, that if this was a play, that nobody in the audience has got anything interesting to say about that apart from Michael Billington? That's a ridiculous proposition. And so you've got this world in which all of you can publish, and you've got The Guardian over here with Michael Billington, and then you've got the potential for 900 other views of tonight over here. So my proposition is a very simple one. If you can do that, why don't we see if we can give her a better account of this occasion by harnessing the best of what you can write. Now, out of 900, maybe only 30 of you want to do it. I'm guessing there are probably 50 people tweeting tonight, but maybe only 30 would actually want to sit down and write something more considered. And out of that, maybe only 10 would be any good. I don't know. But if you had 10 accounts of the play as well as Michael Billington, I think you get a better account of the play. So if that's true, and most journalists agree with that proposition, there are only two other interesting questions. One is, how do you find those 10? How do you find the interesting voices from the less interesting voices? And that is a challenge for journalism. And if we don't meet that challenge, that is certainly going to happen everywhere else. And that gets you back into the argument about paywalls, because you're pitching the value of Michael Billington against the 10 people who might write elsewhere unless you give them the forum. And the second question is, if it works for theatre, does it work across sport, other forms of culture, science, the environment, investigative journalism, politics, war reporting? And in our experience, the answer is nearly always yes. It's nearly always, and we're in the infancy of this, so we're not claiming to have perfected this or to have found the perfect ways of doing it, but nearly always you can get a better account of the thing that you're trying to describe by putting together what we can do with what they can do. And that's why I say this is going to be, that's a very shorthand way of describing what I think of open journalism. And I think in a world in which probably most newspapers are going to have to shed staff and get smaller, then there's a very heavy burden on the Michael Billingtons of this world, the old theatre critics, and you're going to be up against an internet which exponentially is going to have more and more power. And I think there's a very interesting middle ground between this shrinking world that most journalism is going to face and the vast but unmoderated ocean of content over there. And I think there's a very interesting space here in which you think, well, these people who David describes are so passionate about the New York Times and the people who are so passionate about the Guardian, instead of just taking money from them, how else can they help in creating the New York Times or the Guardian? And we may come up with completely different places, but I think it's an interesting question to be asking.
One of the things that Mark Twain wrote about Tom Sawyer, and Tom Sawyer was tasked with painting the fence. And as people came by, he explained how much fun it was to paint the fence, how lovely it was to put the brush up and down and see the white gleaming. We're kind of interested in whether we can't Tom Sawyer our audience and let them help us paint the fence, in addition to coming up with, as Alan points out, we are in the authority business, and their theater critic is leaning on now almost 40 years of experience. But there also is a crowdsourced, mashed up version of hopefully a theater performance, not what happened tonight. I don't want to read the reviews. I'm sure they'd be hurtful. But every time I do a public appearance, I open up Twitter, and I'm just stunned by the amount of feedback, the amount of people pointing out, fact-checking me as I go. It feels as if I'm making my way through the world, and there are like crows on a wire that every time I screw up, they descend, crowing, and caw, 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 whenever I get something wrong. The internet is a self-cleaning oven. Information tends to get better and smarter as the crowd takes effect on it. And we as organizations can't ignore that. We have to engage that apparatus.
No, penso che terremo nel cuore questa metafora delle cornacchie e anche del forno. Allora, senta Alan, però il suo discorso è chiaro. Nell'intervista Intelligent Life che Internazionale ha tradotto, lo ha addirittura reso in termini numerici. Lui ha detto che c'è questo fantastico critico teatrale, credo, del Guardian, Michael Billington, che vale 9, però intorno a lui ci sono una trentina di persone almeno che valgono 6 dal punto di vista della qualità. Allora lui dice: perché lasciare quei 6 ad altri? Perché non provare a fare 9 più 6 più 6 più 6? Fantastica soluzione e bellissima spiegazione. Però leggendola e ascoltandolo stasera, io ho molta paura per il futuro di Michael Billington, perché qualunque direttore finanziario, non so come si chiamano dalle vostre parti, dirà: ma se questo Michael Billington costa quanto costa un giornalista che lavora da 50 anni e produce 9, e questi che non costano, ahimè, praticamente nulla, e in più le chiamate cornacchie, producono 6 e sono tanti. L'ha già capita la domanda, no? Perché tenere Michael Bellington? Che io non conosco, per la verità. Perché tenere Michael Bellington? Perché pagare Michael Bellington?
But I'm describing the reality of the situation. So I think some journalists are in denial about this. They just assert that Michael Billington is much better than the 6 or the 9 or the 10. And therefore, the argument's over. And I think that's not good enough today. I think we have to keep making the argument, and I think it's a safer way to make the argument, is to say, we've got Michael Billington plus them. We're not pitching Michael Billington into competition with them. We've got them over here with Michael Billington. I mean, the other way to think about this, and it's to do with the shrinking the newsroom. You know, a lot of newsrooms have been much more brutal than the New York Times and the Guardian in shedding costs. And again, I think that's one of the reasons why we're still looking pretty good as news organizations. But if you do get rid of Michael Billington and you get to the point where you can't cover things adequately, then the readers will notice. Now, if we currently have 2 or 3 theatre critics working for the Guardian and the Observer, and there are probably 30 really good theatres in Britain. So I'm thinking ahead, and I'm thinking to the time where if you had no Michael Billington, which, as I say, will never happen while I'm editor, or he'll be very relieved to hear that. But if you're an organization that only has 1 theatre critic and doesn't believe in this open journalism, that theatre critic can only be in one place at a time. And he or she is only going to work 4 or 5 nights a week. So you can cover 4 or 5 pieces of theatre a week. But there are plays going on in Manchester and Birmingham and Glasgow and Edinburgh and Bristol, which you are now incapable of covering. But the people who are doing the open journalism will certainly be covering those. So I think if you can leverage the power of what you can do as a news organization by finding good people, then you are more likely to have something that is going to be relevant and valuable. And we're already doing it in science. We have 15 science blogs by really distinguished scientists. There's no question of authority there. If anything, these people are more expert than journalists. We're doing it in the environment when we have 28 partners working with us on the environment. So we are covering the environment infinitely better and deeper and in a more diverse, informed and expert way than we did 20 years ago when we had 1 environment correspondent. There's no question that the Guardian's coverage of these things is so much better. It comes back to the original thing about whether you're going to feel completely pessimistic about this or say that there are techniques that you can use that are, without any question, the best that news organizations have ever produced. But the money is not going to flow neatly. You know, these 2 lines of one of decline and one of growth are not going to meet, and there are all the complications you said to begin with about the crisis in the economy generally. And so you do have to really work out what you believe and what you can afford, but make some fundamental decisions about journalism and what journalism is becoming and how we can best leverage the skills that we have.
One small addendum to what Alan said. If you view International, The Guardian, BBC, The New York Times as being in the signal business over all the noise, there is extreme value in curating. We've never known so much, but we never know where to look. And again, I think as noise increases, you know, information on the web doubles pretty much every year. There's twice as much as there were. And if you think about it, we're right on the cusp of where voice is going to be transcribed immediately into text. It's with 2 to 3 years away. I mean, I already talk to my phone and it knows what I'm saying. I already tweet by talking to my phone. I already respond to short emails. So we're not that far away. So if you think of everything you say being able to be transcribed, there's going to be a huge explosion in searchable text across the web. And you think, well, that's bad for us. I think it's good. I think more clutter allows the signals to stand taller. I don't want to debate the implications of how much more there will be, because if I heard the translation correctly, you threaten to kind of lock the doors and keep us in here all night until we figured out the future of journalism. But we're going to, or I'll stay in here all night long. They're going to bring in some sandwiches later. Maybe a little cup of tea, that's it. But we got to get this figured out. But I do think being in the signal business, we got to play for the long shore, right? We got to play for the long shore. And you correctly, I'm glad you didn't put up a mean diagram about where I work, but if you look at the long shore, Alan suggested, well, we're losing money as a matter of strategy. I don't buy that, but it is a necessary cost as you go forward. Whether you call them losses or investments, there's probably going to end up being a pretty good business at the other end, I think. I mean, part of what you have to think about is on the iPad, what is the difference between a radio station, a newspaper, a website? We're all the same. There's not the radio business. There's not the television business. There's not the magazine business. We all on the tablet have some text, have some video, have some audio. And so this historical verticals that we've all been in, that's over. We're all fighting for the same audience.
Chi va via prima si perderà tutta la lunga notte del giornalismo. È vero, Dave, che è un dato che mi sembrava significativo, che per leggere il New York Times il lettore impiega un'ora e mezza, e invece la media di presenza, di visita online sul sito dura mezzo minuto. Sono veri questi dati che proprio sul New York Times sono stati citati, e che naturalmente dal punto di vista sia profondo, culturale, sia superficiale, economico, pubblicitario, sono assai interessanti.
I think it's a great thing to be thinking about and asking about, because you can say, well, we had 40 million people come and touch our product. The key is, how long did they spend? Did they just toe touch and keep moving? I mean, I personally, when I'm on the web, I have the attention span of a little fly. I get on the web and I don't even remember what did I come on here looking for. Half an hour later, I'm like, what happened to all that time? What we're up against is to create stickiness. And one of the things I want to say about The Guardian, let's say during the hacking scandal, if you look at the hacking scandal, there were these incredible hearings, the Levinson hearings, full of drama, and there was the specter of Rupert Murdoch and his son testifying, and this committee. Their live blog, it was better than watching television. You felt like you were in the thick of things, like you knew exactly. And they would do little like tweet-sized things, and then there'd be a big bit of analysis, and then there'd be a picture, and then there'd be a joke, and there was a texture as you moved through. It's the kind of thing where you go on and you stay on, and that's the fight over and over. And yeah, one of the problems with our website is that you don't have with the newspaper. You get the newspaper and it's 4 sections, and yes, I hope you read my story, but I hope you read a lot of stories. And you go and you go and you go, and then you're done and you set it aside. You can never get to the end of our website. Never, ever, ever. There's hundreds of videos, there's 70 blogs, and what we're trying to do over and over is, how about a little bit of this? How about a little bit of that? When you get down to the end of the story in the New York Times, another related story is immediately sort of served up. It's like Netflix. I don't know if you have it here. When you watch an episode of a television show, it says, do you want to watch the next one? Again and again, we're trying to be more and more sticky so that you don't just bounce on to the next thing in the web. But all the pressure's on us to keep people around because there's, there is no friction to go somewhere else and look at something else. We're in a very competitive world.
David's completely right. So one of the reasons this is such a complicated subject at the moment is the thing that I said earlier about the traffic model, which most of the advertising industry is still on, which requires traffic, but at the same time, David's completely right to say we have to work on a different model, which is engagement, so getting people in and making them stay. He mentioned phone hacking. Phone hacking was a story of The Guardian's, which was an incredibly old-fashioned piece of reporting, if you like. It had nothing to do really with open journalism. It was one reporter spending about 4 years pursuing a story that eventually had dramatic consequences in terms of revealing what had been going on inside one company in particular in Britain. It led to the Leveson inquiry, numerous resignations. So it was a very old-fashioned piece of reporting. In reporting the Leveson hearings, David talks about the live blog. Well, nobody live blogged until about 3 or 4 years ago. And now on The Guardian, the most popular thing on any story is always the live blog. So that's a completely new journalistic technique, which I think of as open journalism, because the best live blogs are things that pull in and incorporate what others are saying and doing. But nobody live blogged 3 or 4 years ago. And yet at the same time, we still have to produce a newspaper in the evening which relies on a different form of journalism, which is the story. It might be 400 words, might be 600 words. And David makes the equally valuable point that in a couple of years' time, well, actually not in a couple of years' time, now, we are increasingly in competition with television. We're essentially the same as television, so we have to work out how to do video as well. And this is why David's skeptical about whether you lose money as a strategy, but the alternative to working your way through doing all these different kinds of journalism, experimenting in video and working out how to live blog, because it's an interesting and better journalistic form in some ways, and also because it gets you the traffic on the old model of advertising. And if you just suddenly, the Guardian board could easily say, look, we can cut these losses tomorrow by we'll just half the journalistic staff, and we'll do this, and this, and this. But that would be a very quick way to destroying the Guardian at precisely the moment when you have to make clever decisions. And so that's why, in a world in which you are up against oligarchs and billionaires, you have to hold your nerve a bit and just say, we will lose money for a bit, but unless we do all these things at the moment, the alternative would be to lose our one hope of making it through into the future.
Una cosa che mi interessava capire era, possiamo dire che i vostri siti, cioè diciamo che c'è una competizione, i vostri siti cominciano a fare o stanno facendo, sono in competizione con la carta? Cioè il direttore dell'Atlantic, che è un mensile statunitense molto interessante che noi ogni tanto pubblichiamo, che racconta che quando hanno cominciato a lavorare sul loro nuovo sito, hanno dato come mandato al responsabile del sito quello di fare un sito degli Atlantic che si comportasse come un concorrente del cartaceo molto agguerrito, cioè il sito dell'Atlantic, la redazione di Atlantic e il direttore di Atlantic dovevano comportarsi come se la loro concorrenza diretta fosse il cartaceo, il loro stesso mensile, con la logica che era quella di dire: se non lo facciamo noi stessi, cioè se non siamo noi a cercare di farci concorrenza da soli, prima o poi comunque qualcun altro lo farà. E quindi tanto vale che proviamo a giocare in casa, insomma, no? A far rimanere qua dentro. Allora mi interessa capire, David, quando tu descrivi un quotidiano come il New York Times dove ci sono 70 blog, video, cioè dove le persone sono incoraggiate a rimanere il più a lungo possibile e quindi a sottrarre tempo, perché il tempo dei nostri lettori è finito, alla lettura del cartaceo, rimanendo comunque dentro il New York Times. Non stiamo descrivendo in qualche modo un modello in cui il web, cioè il proprio web fa concorrenza, insomma, no? E punta in qualche modo alla distruzione del cartaceo, o no?
Yeah, there may be some self-sacrifice involved. One of the things that the pay model does do on the web is it preserves the circulation that you have. When we announced that we're going to have people pay, people said, well, the wall is very leaky. We can get through. Well, that's the idea, that if you want to creepy crawl around, you'll somehow be able to get what we do. After a while, we charge like a convenience charge. We just say, let's be adult about this. You're here all the time. The other thing that it does is the people who are there for a reason, and they're doing. You get the engagement from them because they paid, right? And they want to stick around. And a lot of what's happened is monthlies have to behave like weeklies. Weeklies have to behave like dailies. Dailies have to behave like Twitter. And then at the end of the day, and Alan talked about this, we've done all this stuff, we've done great, we got to make a newspaper. It still has to be produced, because the way we make most our money is we put the white paper out, and in America they give us green paper back, dollars. That's still our main business. One of the things I worry about as a journalist is that I'm going to lose the ability to think long thoughts, that I'm going to become dumber and dumber as time goes by, and I'll be really great on Twitter, but terrible in the newspaper. And you guys were nice enough to reprint a story I did about Neil Young. Well, that was 5,000 words. And I have to tell you, when I opened up the screen, I was like, I don't think I've written anything longer than 140 characters in like 5 days. And now there's this 5,000 word story. And so there is a concern, and I'm sure Alan deals with this, is if we're so busy consuming media as journalists and then producing it at the same time, what happens when you're like me and you're 56 years old and you get really tired? You're tired, right? You know, I've written the story, I made the video about it, I've tweeted it out, I put it on Facebook, I responded to the commentators. I did a little bit of blogging about what came in, and then I get to go to sleep and wake up and do it again. Is that sustainable? It's sustainable for a 25-year-old, but if you're an old tired guy like me, after a while you go, you know what? I need a nap. Whatever happened to siesta time? You know, let's have a little after.
Scusa, Dave è contraddittorio. Prima dice vuoi stare qua tutta la notte, adesso la siesta. Allora, io vorrei fare la stessa domanda, di riportarla a Alan, anche per fare giustizia, perché non tutti capiscono gli accenni continui che facciamo al tabloid gate, cioè lo saprete, ma insomma ve lo dico pure se lo sapete. Il Guardian, cioè questo giornale tutto online che dà tutto gratis, è stato il giornale della più grande, dopo il caso Wikileaks, della più grande inchiesta giornalistica di questi anni, cioè quella che Nick Davis si chiama, il vostro giornalista investigativo, mi sembra, no? Quello principale, ha fatto sul cosiddetto tabloid gate, cioè sul caso di Murdoch, sulle intercettazioni illegali dei giornali del News International Group, quello di Rupert Murdoch, una storia fantastica, di grandissimo lavoro investigativo, tutti gli anni che ha citato, di grandissima scrittura, era un romanzo con dei cattivi assoluti, James Murdoch e Rebecca Brooks sembravano proprio i cattivi dickensiani, cioè una storia straordinaria fatta di giornalismo investigativo. Quella, per esempio, che spazio ha avuto nell'online? Cioè, come avete trattato quella storia che appunto era anche un romanzo, cioè era un feuilleton, ogni giorno c'era una nuova notizia o siete stati bravi a scandire giorno per giorno le notizie che avevate? Come è andata sull'online, dove pure il vostro aggiornamento è continuo? Come ha evitato appunto di cannibalizzare un po' la cosa che diceva Giovanni, poi l'edizione di carta?
Well, the first thing you need to know about the phone hacking story and the WikiLeaks story is that they were both begun by Nick Davis, who's 58.
The great Nick Davis. The great Nick Davis.
Great reporter. And
solo perché ha un anno di più, è grande perché ha un anno di più di... Vero? Sì.
Nick's 58 and he's still got fantastic energy. Nick Davis is 58, who did these stories. He's still got fantastic energy and determination. David Lee, who did the WikiLeaks story, is 67. There are still great reporters doing great work and doing all these things at an advanced stage, or a slightly advanced stage. I talked a bit, I mean, it comes back to what we're talking about earlier, about all the things we have to do. So if The Guardian were to bail out of investigative journalism, stop doing WikiLeaks, stop doing phone hacking, stop doing these kind of things, it would kind of lose one of its purposes for being. It would be a very good reason not to buy The Guardian if we weren't to have the kind of investigative teams that we do. It would be fatal for The Guardian if at any point we had asked the question that Giovanni was asking earlier and saying, but if we invest in all this digital, it's going to cannibalize print. That is obviously true, but it would have been a terrible reason not to invest in digital. I think there's a more interesting question now, which some newspapers are thinking about, is how you get the, not simply through paywalls, but how you get through, how you make the newspaper complement what you're doing digitally. And there's a very interesting, they clearly have different functions now. Most Guardian readers now read the paper in the evening, not the morning. Very few Guardian readers buy the newspaper expecting to learn news. They kind of know the news by the time they pick up the Guardian. So the function of the newspaper is changing to something that is going to explain it rather than break it. And there are newspapers now that are experimenting. The Svenska Dagbladet in Stockholm is one, where they now plan around 40% of the newspaper 7 days in advance. That sounds like an impossible task for a daily newspaper. But the circulation of that paper is going up because they're differentiating it from what the web is doing, and it is being a more useful thing in print to read in the evening and contextualize, explain, and analyze, whereas they would be doing the breaking news and the live blogging digitally. So in order to organize your newsroom like that, you might be doing something completely different from how you organized it 3 years ago, when broadly we were all integrating the newsrooms. So that there is never a point where you can stand still and say, we've got the right structures. It is all at the moment about experimentation. And none of us can stand on any of these platforms and say that we've cracked it or we can be certain about the future. But you sure as hell have to try and understand and experiment with it, which is an expensive business, or you're certainly going to have no future.
One of the things that when I came to the Times, I'd worked at a website, all web, no print, and I watched them meet at 4 o'clock and decide, these are the 7 stories, these are the 6 stories we're going to put on the front page of the newspaper, and I felt as I had stumbled across some ancient tribal ritual that happened a long, long time ago, and I thought, this is silly because if you watch above them, the web is above them on a wall, and stories are pivoting and changing and dropping down, and new ones are popping in. And I think, what could be the value of at a certain point, in our instance, 10 o'clock at East Coast time, going, stop. These are the 6 stories that we're gonna put on the front page. You know what? I still get the daily paper, and here's why. It's because of what Alan is talking about is there is, every day, all this stuff is whooshing by me. I know what happened. I never know why. And I like, and this may go to my age, but I like having a hierarchy of upper right is the most important story. Here's a big picture of something you should know about. That it puts a skin on the previous day's events so that some of it sticks with me and doesn't go whooshing by. Now, it's just really one group's idea of what was important, but I have trouble, given the amount and velocity of data that I take in every day, of making sense of it. So I do think that the daily newspaper, which for a while I thought was kind of a charming artifact, serves an important function in my life, in organizing what happened. It's kind of a magazine-like function.
Allora, come avete visto, qualcuno è andato anche su questo palco da Capostela, ma era come dire, istituzione. E adesso c'è lo spazio per le vostre domande, anche per ringraziarvi di essere stati qui finora. Insomma, mi sembra che il materiale era moltissimo, questi accenni finali erano molto belli. Alan si riferiva a un giornale svedese, avete capito che una settimana prima decide gli articoli, quella è quella che noi chiamiamo, come fosse un rischio, una direzione alla settimanalizzazione dei quotidiani, cioè quotidiani fatti soprattutto di pezzi di inchiesta, di narrazione ampia. Del resto, dice Dave, mi sembra anche questa un'idea bella, c'è un momento in cui si mette un fermo al flusso delle notizie e se quello corrisponde alla nostra organizzazione mentale compriamo quel giornale. Questo serviva al microfono, non è una cosa, serviva al microfono ad arrivare alla prima persona che faceva la domanda.
Salve, buonasera. Io volevo fare forse una domanda un po' strana, assurda, ma il fatto che comunque non ci siano soldi per fare giornalismo buono, però noi come lettori vogliamo che voi continuate a fare il vostro lavoro e vogliamo che voi lo facciate bene. E mi è venuta un'idea, un lapsus, potrebbe essere quello di presentare i vostri giornalisti con i loro progetti, cioè quello che fate voi nella redazione, per esempio, domani si scrive l'articolo su questo, domani si scrive l'articolo di quest'altra cosa, pubblicarlo in internet e noi come lettori possiamo adottare il giornalista, quindi possiamo anche noi scegliere le storie che vogliamo che voi raccontate, perché le storie siamo noi. E quindi perché dateci anche a noi il privilegio di far sentire più una voce che vogliamo sentire in quel momento piuttosto che un'altra. Cioè, non lo so se è assurdo, se ci avete mai pensato, se è un'idea.
Non farti questa domanda se è assurdo. Sentiamo che pensano di questa.
No, e l'ultima cosa, il contributo che noi dovremmo dare, oltre a scegliere magari il giornalista e pagare, oltre a scegliere il giornalista e magari la storia che vogliamo sentire, anche un contributo economico da partire da $3 fino a massimo $30 a persona. Ogni persona non può dare più di $30.
Volete cominciare con loro due a fare queste offerte?
Sì. Grazie.
I think it's a very interesting idea, and we do it a bit at the moment. So one of the things that used to be the most closely guarded bit of a newspaper's operation was its news list, the things that we would be covering tomorrow. In fact, we now publish our news list, we open source our news list. And on the comment site, we begin the day by saying, who wants to read what pieces on commentary today? And we get a lot of good ideas from both these sources, from both news and comment. I think it's an idea that is also worth thinking about as to the relationship, as you're suggesting, as to whether that can become an income stream as well. You can all imagine the problems, but in America, I've lost count of the number of people who say, if only the Guardian would cover inequality or social injustice or race or gun control or the death penalty, I'd write you a check for $100 right now. And 10 years ago, I think most journalists would have said that's inconceivable. Now, I would like to know the reasons why not. I can think of all the reasons why not. But there are also examples where we take $750,000 from the Gates Foundation to cover international global development, because that's something we're rather good at. And I don't think that money has polluted what we do. So we understand clearly the rules about that there are no strings attached to this money beyond that we cover international development. So increasingly, I think this idea of readers having some say in what they consider important and maybe wanting to attach that to money is an interesting idea for all that it's very easy to imagine what the problems are with the idea as well.
I don't think it's a silly or absurd idea at all, and I'd like to get it started tonight by suggesting, and I'll be taking donations afterwards. I'm going to move through with a can. The story is going to be about an American who has not a single word of Italian, spending a week in Italy, gorging on food, coveting your fast trains, speaking horrible Italian to people, and pretending like he should be understood. Today, I went out in Ferrara, which is a walled city, and I couldn't find the wall. I think it's going to be a great story. It's going to be an amazing story. Seriously, 3 years ago in the US, there was a wholesale effort to, as you say, crowdsource not just the funding, but the assigning of stories. It didn't work out. It doesn't mean it can't work out. And there are examples, the American site Kickstarter, where people are setting up films, setting up books, setting up ongoing lines of investigation, and asking people to contribute. Books have come out, movies, documentaries have come out of it, and important stories have come out of it. Increasingly, thought-leading magazines like Mother Jones or The Nation is turning toward its readers and saying, what do you want to know about? What can you help us fund? The thing is you don't want all of your news chosen by an algorithm, by a crowdsource. Because if you said to the general public 5 years ago, what about a deep, long, 4-year investigation into whether the phones of some celebrities and royals had been hacked? A lot of people would say, I don't care about that. I'm sure it happens. I don't care. It ended up being a story of very significant implications. So the wisdom of the crowd is not always wise, and sometimes you have to give people not what they want, but what you think they may want. But I do think there's an American journalism professor, Jeffrey Rosen, calls consumers of news the people formerly known as the audience. And in the instance of Alan's paper, they're helping build the paper. And in many, many ways going forward, you know, there's magazines that are made in 24 hours based on a theme, and people are given the opportunity to set in. I think the line between you and me, even though I'm the one up on stage right now, is getting closer and closer. And don't forget my little story I'm going to be collecting about later. I'll take dollars or euros, up to you.
Buonasera, salve, sono qui. Io scrivo per un quotidiano online sfigatissimo, penso il più sfigato del Meridione, e per me è inevitabile fare questa domanda. In realtà ne ho due, ma cercherò di essere il più breve possibile. La prima è la seguente. Noi noi, e con noi riferisco laureandi, laureati, ragazzi che si approcciano a internet perché è il mezzo più veloce per intraprendere questo mestiere, siamo disperati. La situazione in Europa e anche nel resto del mondo è abbastanza diciamo paritaria, uguale, ma qui vi assicuro che la situazione, almeno per noi, e parlo in prima persona, è disperata, perché io sono venuta a Ferrara e mi sono autofinanziata per il piacere totale di poter essere qui e di poter assistere a qualcosa che non avevo mai visto nella mia vita, e per potermi confrontare con persone che fanno seriamente il giornalista, non come me che sono, diciamo, nella professione da pochissimo tempo. Ora, c'è un detto americano che penso conosciate entrambi, che dice che la vita ti dà i limoni e quindi tu devi fare la limonata. Ora, io mi sento in grado di fare la limonata, ma non trovo qualcuno che mi vende i semi, non so come mi devo approcciare a questa professione, non so se è giusto rimanere nel giornalismo online, se mi devo spostare sulla carta stampata, non so che cosa fare. E noi intendo le persone della mia età che si approcciano adesso a questo mestiere, che adesso diventano pubblicisti, iniziano a scrivere. Non abbiamo molti punti di riferimento, i nostri modelli o sono troppo grandi o sono troppo distanti. Voi che cosa consigliereste a una persona che sta per iniziare la carriera che voi avete iniziato molto tempo fa? E la mia seconda domanda sarà velocissima. Domani ricorre l'anniversario della morte di Anna Politkovskaja. Io sto scrivendo la mia tesi di laurea su di lei ed è un personaggio che mi è estremamente caro, perché penso che abbia dato un contributo senza prezzo al mondo del giornalismo e dell'informazione. Però ho la sensazione che, a parte internazionale, a parte alcuni piccoli, alcune piccole realtà, tra virgolette piccole, la ricordino, ma il resto del mondo è come se si fosse dimenticato di lei. Vorrei sapere voi cosa ne pensate, se avete intenzione di ricordarla in qualche modo, se i vostri giornali ne parleranno. Grazie.
Wow, those are two pretty tough questions. One thing I would observe is you seem like the kind of person who could take lemons and make Chianti out of them. You seem very determined. And that's a good thing, because, you know, journalism has always been brutal to get into, always sucked. Back when I was getting into journalism, when dinosaurs roamed the earth, everybody told me, you can't get in, it sucks. There's no way into journalism, can't be done. Don't pay any attention to those people, number one. Number two, people want to know over and over, can you make stuff? It's not, oh, here's my clips from the college paper, I did this, I did that. You want to be able to show them the video that you did this weekend, the live blogging you've done of an event. They want to see a subject of ongoing inquiry besides your dating life or what your cat does for fun. Again and again, you have to be able to show, because you have the tools of production to show work. And I don't think that you know, publicly identifying the people you work with, the shittiest website there ever was on earth, is probably a great professional strategy. But you have to start low, 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 and creepy crawl around. And I don't think that has changed, even though the model has been interrupted. To your second question, quite concisely, we have a large Moscow bureau with 5 and sometimes 8 of the best journalists in the world, and I bow to no one in terms of what we've written about Anna's death or any other Russian journalist. It has been a persistent, chronic interest of ours, not just in Russia, but all over the world, how some people pay the cost of doing journalism, not by working at crappy jobs, but with their very lives. And I think we've been pretty stalwart in covering that. I just need to assert that on behalf of my employer.
I echo a lot of what David said. I think, I mean, clearly, I think young people who are digital, but even as I say the word young, it's not necessarily the right way of thinking about it. People who have grown up digital have an advantage that a lot of people in traditional newsrooms don't. So that's something you have going for you. I completely endorse what David says about just doing it. And I think in just doing it, you don't have to think too narrowly initially about newspapers. Journalism, this horrible word, content, is everywhere. There are supermarkets who are now doing journalism. There are opera houses doing journalism. There are NGOs doing journalism, i.e. they're producing content that is not, in many respects, significantly different from what is. So the opportunity to create and publish is there for everybody. In the square before I came in, a complete stranger came up to me and said, "I write for The Guardian." I looked at her blankly and I said, "I've got no idea who you are." And she said, "I'm Tea and Chocolate. Is Tea and Chocolate here somewhere?" And I instantly knew who she was because she's always on the threads writing in The Guardian. There are 70 people who started below the threads, below the line in The Guardian, who are now writing comment pieces. Half the stuff that we write in sport is now contributed by people who are so-called below the line. We've created 2 or 3 star columnists who just started as commenters on The Guardian. So the opportunity to practice, to get noticed, to practice the art of journalism can be done in a myriad number of ways. And it's not going to be the way that David and I came into journalism, but there are lots of ways of just practicing this muscle of writing or blogging or creating content. And in a way, it's never been more open for people to do that and to quickly attract attention to themselves.
One small point I want to add. I have a colleague, Brian Stelter, who came to our newspaper, 23 years old. He was a blogger. And Brian, like you, probably, for him, consuming information and putting it out, not discrete activities. They're the same. They're part of the same cycle. Historically, when I'm going to write a story, I gather all known thought, print it out, look at it, mark it up, and then at a certain point become typing. I can remember the night that Osama bin Laden was killed. I saw it kind of blowing up on Twitter, and then saw people reacting to it elsewhere, and I thought, I don't cover the story, but I cover the media, and part of this is a media story that the first signs of it we saw on Twitter, and that represents. And so, just about the time I figure out, you know what, I was like, someone should write a blog post about this. I opened up the blog that I contribute, and my young colleague, Brian Stelter, had 900 words sitting there. Now, I'd like to strangle him. I'd like to put a pillow over his face and make it so that he didn't make me look so bad. But again and again, you've grown up in a way, as Alan points, where you don't finish reading everything. The minute things happen, you start writing and reacting to it. And you don't wear out as quickly as those old guys. So you probably, your time will come. So.
Buonasera. Prima avete parlato dell'importanza di curare le relazioni con il proprio pubblico, ad esempio attraverso i social network, quindi attraverso i propri profili Twitter e le proprie pagine Facebook personali. Il problema è che molto spesso, soprattutto i giornalisti un po' più grandi, diciamo, sembrano solo voler far finta di curare queste relazioni, e questo si esemplifica ad esempio quando alcuni profili Twitter o alcune pagine fan non sono gestite direttamente dalla persona che compare come nome e cognome, ma da un esperto in comunicazione che cura i rapporti per lui. E quindi in realtà io, sentendo le vostre parole, sembrate sicuramente dei giornalisti di una volta, ma illuminati allo stesso tempo, perché in realtà i giornalisti più grandi sembrano davvero poco interessarsi a quello che è il parere del popolo, il parere del popolino, dell'audience, che appunto è vista solo come una grande massa dalla quale non è interessante prendere dei contenuti, ma è interessante solo dare qualcosa, che è il proprio articolo, il proprio prodotto culturale. E quindi volevo sapere da voi se veramente c'è un interesse da parte vostra a sentire i nostri pareri, perché appunto, come veniva detto prima, su 900 recensioni almeno 10 potrebbero essere interessanti, ma la domanda è: a voi interessano veramente quelle 10 o comunque è solo una tecnica, diciamo, comunicativa per darci un potere che poi forse non abbiamo?
Well, everything I've said tonight about open journalism is about this thing that David was talking about, that the distance between us is getting smaller and smaller. And I think any editor who was cynical enough just to use these as distribution techniques or broadcast techniques and not to be passionately interested in what's coming back and how that can change our view of what's happening is just neglecting an opportunity that's never been there for journalists in the past. So quite often you publish a story, the reaction starts coming in within seconds or minutes, either on Twitter or on the space that we provide on The Guardian, and you're really surprised. I'm really surprised. I think I completely misjudged how that story was going to play. And part of my job now as editor is to watch that and to read it and let that inform you, because the gulf between readers and editors in the past was vast. Their only way of responding was to write a letter, and somebody, usually not the editor, would make a very small selection of those letters, and now you can have a much better sense of what works, what doesn't work, of whether you've judged things or not, and that should make your journalism better.
I think that your skepticism is entirely appropriate. You have mainstream news organizations that ignored their audiences for years after years after years, one-way communication. All of a sudden, with the rise of social media, it's like, we love social media. We just think it's great. And when you pull back the blankets on the avatar, there's nobody there. There's nobody really interested in an ongoing conversation. I do think that there are two problems. I'm just speaking as a working journalist with at a certain point, when do you stop talking about the last story and start doing the next one, right? And one of the things I wrote about there being that in the US, liberal bias in the media was a myth, because you've got Fox News, you've got Wall Street Journal, you got Rush Limbaugh, you have all these large conservative forces. I get hundreds of emails, and I used to say, I answer every single email, and proudly so. I get totally overwhelmed. One. Two is, if you veer toward anything political, the rhetoric is so, excuse me, fucking toxic, that that we're not meeting in a public square and having a conversation. What we're talking about is people who were in their mom's basement typing and ranting as if no one was at the other end. And so a lot of times I write back to these guys, and even though they've called me a moron and said everything I said was stupid, I said, I appreciate your bracing feedback and taking the time to read what I wrote. And they calm down right away. They get really civil right away, because they figure they're screaming into a hole, down a well, and nobody's listening to them. And as soon as you respond, they calm down, they get a lot more reasonable. But as a working journalist, I get caught up, how much time should I spend talking about the story I just did versus doing the story that my editor wants? Because my editor isn't, as you probably suspect, the editor, you know, yes, we'd like you to be involved in comments. They're more interested in your next story.
L'ultima domanda, cioè perché? Quella cosa che stavamo tutta la notte, che ha detto no. Allora, la cosa che Dave ha detto che stiamo tutta la notte non è vera, la cosa che sta raccogliendo i soldi, quella sì.
Sì. Allora loro scappano giustamente perché dice qui.
No, ma si paga all'uscita.
Si paga all'uscita. L'ultima domanda.
Si paga nulla per entrare.
Yeah, I've got people at the doors
Yeah.
with great big tin cans.
Non c'è l'ultima domanda. Cioè, eccoci. L'onore e l'onere dell'ultima domanda.
Ehi,
Eccola.
una domanda da...
Volante.
E come si fa lassù? Puoi urlare?
No, falla in italiano, in italiano.
Le domande dalle cose sono sempre particolari. Ci sono delle persone
No, I think it's cool.
Hai capito?
There is a way, again and again, how do the best surfaces, like, why are there people on Twitter, on Facebook that have so many more followers than anybody else? How do they, again and again, the crowd surfaces great work, time and time. Again, it isn't really just Alan that's deciding who the 10 best is. If you think of the American social network, Reddit, where things get voted up, and if you do something that's good, my daughter is 25 years old, and she did a video for the people that she works for. It was about these little organisms that can live in space, and I'm like, pat her on the head and say, honey, that's cute. You did your little video for your website. I'm proud of you. She got 10 million views. 10 million views. And it's the power of algorithms, where Reddit liked it because it was a weird little science story, and then other social networks picked up on it, Twitter picked up on it, and then YouTube started to notice and pushed it up. Her work has now been seen her one piece has now been seen by more people than have seen all my work in my entire lifetime. Again, I'd like to take a pillow and suffocate her, but I'm related to her.
These are partly algorithms, but what David's describing is 10 million acts of judgment. It is 10 million acts of human acts of judgment in voting for something or not voting. If we were going to decide out of the 900 people who at least started here this evening, who were going to be the 10 interesting people, it's probably right that there's no algorithm that's going to do that, and it shouldn't be me that the most effective way of doing it would be to get people to the people who read to decide who are the people who are the interesting voices and who are not the interesting voices. But this balance between human judgment and algorithms and technology is where this interesting space lies at the moment, between what I was talking about earlier, that what we could too easily convince ourselves, or maybe the reality of these declining old news organizations, and this space that David's been talking about tonight, which is, with the ability to turn speech into text, this vast ocean of stuff. Twitter is already completely unmanageable to most people because it just moves so fast. And that's the interesting opportunity, but in order to find that curated and edited space, we have to understand the technology and invest in trying to understand it.
Ci fermiamo qui ringraziandovi veramente per la partecipazione, Dave e Alan. Ringraziamo voi per la vostra... devo ringraziare Marina Astrologo e Giuliana Clementi, che sono le traduttrici, utili a una parte di noi almeno. Adesso si va, dove si va? In piazza e domani qua.
Sì. C'è vinciuta
Arrivederci, buona
Grazie,
serata.
buonasera, buonanotte.